you would share this evening with me about a very important issue. It means a lot, so thank you guys very much. So the topic of my talk tonight is called, what is tolerance, really? Because I think that word is perhaps one of the most confused words in our society right now. There are many words that are confused in our society right now, including a word that should be quite basic as what is a woman, but unfortunately a lot of people are confused about that as well. And I think that when our language is confused, we can't move forward together as a society on common ground towards common ends. And unfortunately, this has been the result of that phenomenon, which we'll discuss later once we're into the topic. But I want this to be a conversation. I don't want this to be me speaking at you or lecturing you. I don't like that, it's not productive, and it actually goes against the spirit of what I want to achieve in this country, which is a revolution of the mind, where we can think critically about issues beyond the surface and delve deeply into the substance that may help our country regain new health and how we talk about things. So, let me ask this question. Who here has an idea of what tolerance means? Anyone can just throw out an answer, I don't care. Who has an idea? Go.
Pluralism.
Okay, interesting. What does that mean?
Like an acceptance of people who have different opinions.
Okay, anyone else?
Putting up with a behavior or action.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, so I think that, again, as I mentioned, the word tolerance has been so politically charged because there are particular institutions in our society that have their own definition of tolerance, and they have used it for the past few decades to cram it down the throats of Americans and to convince them that their definition of tolerance not only is acceptable, but it is the only single one that can happen in society if we're going to be just and if we're going to be equitable. And this is the source of our woes here. Now, in order to explain what I mean, I'm going to quote one of the biggest organizations in the nonprofit sphere that has influenced how our culture thinks about tolerance, the Southern Poverty Law Center. You guys may know who they are. They have a reputation for labeling people who have conservative opinions as terrorists and as all kinds of bad things. They've lost credibility, really, but unfortunately the media still quotes them, people still cite them, and so we have to be charitable to people, even if they have their own opinions. So, the Southern Poverty Law Center had a program called Teaching Tolerance, where they went into classrooms, nonprofits, institutions across the country, and they presented a single idea of tolerance, educational materials and other kinds of things as well. And they quite literally said, this is a progressive idea of tolerance, because they noted that conservative environments don't like them very much. Now, before we continue, we should note one thing. If your idea of tolerance does not include every single, all viewpoints equally, then it's not tolerance whatsoever. It's an idea masquerading under the skin suit of tolerance, and thus you should be suspicious of it because it's being presented to you in a deceptive way. So the SPLC, this is from their website, says that their program, Teaching Tolerance, came out of the idea that the best way to prevent hatred and violence is to start changing attitudes amongst children. Now, many of us understand that on the educational battleground, children are the targets. Many of us understand that in terms of whether it be gender ideology in the classroom, whether it be teaching inappropriate concepts to people in 3rd grade, 4th grade, which states like Maryland tried to do. Children have been the coveted resource for the cultural left. So that should, whenever you hear someone talking about a political program that involves children, that is not simply protecting their innocence, you should be worried. You should be worried because it means something very bad for our country. And so they go on to say that schools are the best possible opportunity because everyone goes to school. Public schools bring together people of all kinds. It's a great opportunity for a program that reduces prejudice. So the idea here is not to instill tolerance. Their idea of tolerance is instead indoctrinating people with a certain idea of what that word means to the exclusion of ideas they consider to be prejudicial. Now again, prejudice is one of those words we have to look at because if someone calls you prejudice, the immediate assumption of most normal people is to not like you. Because who likes a prejudiced person, a mean person, a bigoted person? Very few folks do. So that is a very powerful weapon that can be used to shut down different perspectives, opinions, and philosophies, and advance forth a single narrative without a sort of pushback. Because if there's pushback, that pushback will then immediately be couched as prejudicial, intolerant, or whatever, so they want to use that. And so this idea is not about tolerance. It is a proxy for a political agenda that wears the skin suit of tolerance to push its aims. And I think that this actually speaks to a problem. Those of us who do support a real idea of tolerance, and I'll actually explain what that means in a second, have. There's something within the structure of the word tolerance that actually leaves it open to viewpoints that may not like it very much. In a tolerant society, the idea is that at least it used to be, that you appreciate or at least you accept all viewpoints equally within a neutral framework. Well, what happens when there is an intolerant viewpoint that does not agree with the neutral framework, but instead uses the framework slyly to hijack it and hijack your institutions with their own idea of what that means? What happens is you get what we see now, the redefinition of words, language, and all that kind of stuff. But also, there's a broader context for us to talk about, and that context is multiculturalism. So the word tolerance is oftentimes presented in a multicultural context, that all cultures, and the idea of multiculturalism is that all cultures are valuable, and they specifically say that the minority culture is inherently oppressed by the dominant culture. The dominant culture is inherently oppressive because it demands the minority culture to assimilate to it. So for example, if someone comes to America, there has been a historical demand for assimilation. Even in the 1920s when we had a lot of immigration, Irish Catholics came over here. Well, they assimilated because there was an expectation that they assimilate. It's not the same thing today, but we'll talk about that later. And so assimilation to the multiculturalist is intolerant and it's evil because it doesn't respect differences under their framework. So if you can see how they've taken the idea of tolerance and twisted this into this sort of zombified idea that anything that is different within their cultural program is good, and everything that is not conform to their idea of tolerance is also bad, you can see where we got. Multiculturalism is the idea that there is no meaningful room to judge other cultures or to judge the values of other cultures, because again, it has to do with the culture being a minority culture and a dominant culture. It's kind of similar to critical race theory in a sense. Because critical race theory proposes the idea that there is an oppressor and an oppressed class. And the oppressed class, by virtue of them being an oppressed class, should get excuses for almost everything they do. Look at what happened during 2020, when there were George Floyd riots in Minneapolis and so on and so forth. We were told repeatedly, ad nauseum, that riots were the voice of the oppressed. Under any other context, destroying your own businesses, your own communities, and harming the livelihoods of people would never be considered tolerant, good, or virtuous. But under the oppressor-oppressed frame, under multiculturalism, not only is it the essence of tolerance, it's also the essence of virtue, and if you dare question it, you are somehow committing some great form of evil. The truth is, the mainstream cultural idea of tolerance is not tolerant. And unfortunately, it has been used to oppress viewpoints that happen to be quite different. And I think one of the best examples of this is in the example of hate speech. Now, here's how this works. They say that tolerance means reducing prejudice and bias. Now, all of us have biases. And if you're smart, you have prejudices too. If you're going to go in the woods in the middle of the night with no flashlight, nothing to defend yourself, no bear spray, then unfortunately, I'm not sure you're a very smart person. You should have a prejudice to dying. So everyone has prejudices. But they immediately assume that prejudices are bad for some reason, I'm not quite sure. And that immediately conceals the topic from being able to honestly talk about the issue. So they say that biases and prejudice is bad. And then they go on to say, in order to stop those things that are bad and preserve tolerance, we need to enact regulations. Now, these regulations have had different characters and different shades. For a very long time, campuses have dealt with speech codes that restrict the amount of things that certain people can say under the banner of them being hateful. In general society, there's an idea called hate speech, which in the name of protecting tolerance restricts what you can say in the name of protecting tolerance, and that, by very definition, is not quite tolerant. We see the results of this all across the world. If you're a streamer or a YouTuber in Scotland, for example, or in the United Kingdom, you can get arrested for making a joke against people that are considered to be protected class, all in the name of tolerance. Again, this is how they hijack these important words, and they use it for a different purpose than what they were actually meant for. So, I've talked about the left's idea of tolerance. Let's talk about the right idea of tolerance. Tolerance has a few levels, has social level and a political level. The social is more important than the political, but there's been this lie that has confused the minds of men for decades, since the 60s, that says the personal is the political. And you can't get more dangerous than that. And that was the mantra of feminism that allowed a lot of destructive things to happen to the family and to general society under the guise of it being liberating. So again, if you question those premises, you're somehow an oppressor. So on a social level, tolerance means providing an equal standard to diverse perspectives and lifestyles within proper constraints. So obviously as a society, we have certain ethical standards that we set for what is acceptable. In a smart society, the standards are not based on your own opinions or your own wins. In fact, I was talking to one of the TPUSA guys about this earlier, that there's this confusion in modern thought between what is permissible and what is preferable, right? So what is permissible are the things that are allowed within the context, the bare bones context of proper ethical action that relates to first principles like respecting property, respecting life, and respecting someone's ability to act their liberty within that context. What is preferable are the things that are not mandated within that context, but would actually help the society and enhance how good it is. So for example, you can't mandate someone be charitable. It just doesn't work that way because charity requires a connection to somebody. And you can't force someone to have a connection with someone because in other words, that's not charity, it's pity. But it's preferable if we were all going to donate to good charities, not the ones that scam you and say we're gonna help kids in Africa and they end up appropriating funds elsewhere, but good charities that actually do good things and you support them, that makes society better. But it's not required for society to function. For example, it's very important to be kind to people. But you can have a society that functions at the very base level without kindness. It won't be a very good society, but it will be an acceptable society. When we can differentiate what is preferable and what is permissible, then we can actually talk about these issues in a sane way, because oftentimes when we don't do those things, we confuse our tastes with morality, right? So we should always differentiate between ethics and morality. Ethics are the set of principles that society needs to run, based, at least under my framework and the framework of the founders and Jefferson, natural law, whereas morality are the personal feelings you have towards certain issues in society that may be influenced by what? Your traditions, your norms, your culture. Both are important to a good society, but only one of those things is necessary for that society to exist. And the problem is, a lot of people like talk about freedom, which is under the idea of personal permissibility, but we don't sometimes talk about morality, which is very important, even if we don't want to enact it on the sort of political level. And this leads me to my next point. On a political level, tolerance simply means rejecting favoritism and ideological bigotry while maintaining a neutral posture to competing ideas. So this is called value neutrality. Value neutrality is the idea that institutions and political power in society are meant not to take a position on a particular issue, but instead to act as a mediator of sorts between varying perspectives and to allow them to exist within social context. The problem is, that idea only works if all parties respect the neutrality. And this is part of the problem that a lot of conservatives have pointed out over the past few decades. Progressivism, leftism, does not respect that neutrality. In fact, it actually opposes it. It opposes it. And I say this because I'm looking at the words of people like Woodrow Wilson, people like Mr. Hupperly, who actually helped invent the idea of public school administration in America, people like John Dewey, who wrote literally that children were not being educated properly, they need to be educated to be socially conscious. Those are his words, not mine. Of people that went off to Prussia in the 1830s and learned from a guy called Wilhelm von Humboldt that education is about Wissenschaft. And Wissenschaft is teaching people for education's sake and to preserve the state in a large society. It has nothing to do with the actual individual student. And they take that idea, they establish universities in America, and it becomes all about the politics of what professor can get this research paper, all about the politics of how the institution can advance itself. You ever heard that term, institutional advancement? That's all from Prussia. It all comes from this idea that status is more important than the substance of the education and the people being educated. And that is the spell that the left has put America under for the past few decades. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was even quite clear about it. He said that the values of the Constitution are not important in his essay called The Study of Administration. What's more important is how you apply political mechanisms for general society, how you actually deal with the issues facing you in the current day. The argument was the Constitution was outdated. And what needed to happen was we needed to just administer things that they thought in their righteous minds was proper, necessary, and good. When that happened, value neutrality went away. Because at that point, the Constitution, which prescribes value neutrality, literally in the first 10 amendments, that Constitution went away. And what instead happened was that America was put under a new kind of political and social order. And this political and social order gave birth to so many different things. Whether it be the feminist movement, which started off good but then became really bad, began saying that the personal and political are separate, and that's absolutely the opposite. Whether it be the child welfare movement, which started off with good intentions to protect children, but then enabled welfare, enabled no-fault divorce, enabled CPS to do what they're doing now, which is take children away from their parents because their parents don't want to accept that their children has a gender identity about them. 7, 8-year-old kids, the state now has the ability to do that. All of these things are a lack of value neutrality, but they are the status quo of our current political order. So, unfortunately, a lot of people will say, Christian, value neutrality is an old idea. It's not in power anymore. The left has taken that away. We need to fight fire with fire. The problem becomes that the more we head down this path, the less like America our country gets. There are some people that might like that. There are some folks that believe that the conception of America as a country built on natural law, a country built on an acknowledgement of the spiritual value of the individual, a country built on consent of the governor and classical republicanism has failed. I don't think that's true. What I think is true is that America has been hijacked by forces that want to see it fail, want to see it altered from its original conception into something that it absolutely is not. And tolerance, so-called, has been one of the ways to do that. So to reclaim that, we need to get a new tolerance and reassert the virtues and the values of having value neutrality. That's the only way a society functions. People can squabble amongst themselves in their personal capacities, in your societies, that's fine. That's actually good. The kind of discussions that we have, the kind of debates that we have, are not only essential for a flourishing society, they're essential for the health of the mind. And if you're in a society where there is this culture of mass distraction, I call it, where TikTok is the standard, where 60-second sound bites are the standard, and where most politically aware people can only speak in talking points, you can't have a society that is divorced from factionalism. You have a society that is literally being raised on factionalism. And so I think by asserting value neutrality, we can hopefully get away with that. But on an institutional level, tolerance also means that diversity of thought is very important in the institution. Now let's explain this empirically before I go into the philosophy of it. There was a study put out by the largest human resources organization in America that showed that policies that push particular political ideologies in the workplace, regardless of what they are, this happened in the context of like DEI and stuff, actually made toxic workplaces, made workers feel as if they couldn't speak their mind without retribution, made people want to leave the workplace. And that's what's happened. We've had people like Coca-Cola do a Be Less White training where they basically tell their employees that their whiteness is a sin. We've had companies like American Express do the same kind of thing where they literally hired the great-grandson, the grandson of the nation of Elijah Muhammad, who founded the Nation of Islam, to tell their white employees that capitalism was evil. The problem becomes when diversity of thought is used as a skin suit for the sort of Fox idea of diversity, which doesn't involve a diversity of thought whatsoever, but involves diversity in the context of identity and a particular interpretation of identity at that point, and then casts diversity as being in that particular light. That's why I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually flawed. Because when you root diversity and identity, you actually miss out what diversity is. Because you can have several people that are of the same identity who have radically different thoughts. But when race or sexuality or gender become a proxy for diversity, then you absolutely miss the point of what it means. So let me just recap. Diversity on a political level means respecting value neutrality institutions. On a social level, it means entertaining ideas that are different from yours within the context of what's permissible and preferable. And on a general institutional level, like in our universities, it 100% means respecting a diversity of thought. Now, in order to do these things, we have to kind of reclaim a few words, reclaim a few concepts. It's obvious to me that the word diversity, like the word tolerance, has also been hijacked. And it's been hijacked in a way where there are people that believe that diversity means something that it may not actually mean, but they've taken offense to it because it's been used against them like a political weapon. So I think for the survival of society, it's quite important that we look at this and we deal with it in the best way possible. And so how do we fix this? How do we beat the criticisms? Because there are a few criticisms of what I'm saying. On the left, they would say that Christian, by embracing an equal idea of tolerance as opposed to an equitable idea of tolerance, you are allowing past prejudices and injustices to actually flourish. You are, because if you're colorblind, the argument goes, you're actually ignoring racism. I think it's the opposite. Racism was actually birthed by a lack of colorblindness. It was actually birthed by a pending value to skin color. It was birthed by doing what I say, confusing aesthetics with ethics, confusing your personal tastes and your personal perspectives with what is actually ethically correct. And that created an entire political system that was not correct, but a political system that is now being used, the history of it, to call America an evil and racist nation when that is absolutely far from the truth. So I don't think that if we embrace an equal approach, which is going to be giving equal grounding to all viewpoints, as opposed to an equitable approach, that we're going to be in a bad place or we're going to ignore things. We'll actually be able to know more things because we won't be shackled by the identity of race or by the ideology of those kind of things, we'll be able to have clear conversations that go beyond our own personal perspectives. The closer an issue is to you, the more it's going to matter and the more it's going to sting and hurt someone disagrees with you. But we have a society, unfortunately, where emotion is not only seen as a valuable thing to be included in conversation, it's almost seen as a moral necessity. Who here has heard the term lived experience? Anyone? Who here has heard the term that your feelings are valid? Anyone? Okay. Well, I'm going to say some things you might not like. Not all your feelings are valid, some of them are nonsense. And your lived experience does not matter in terms of truth. If your lived experience contradicts the truth, then I'm sorry, it's just your experience, and I'm not required or obligated to conform my worldview to it. But under this idea of tolerance that I'm proposing, I am obligated to hear you out and not try to shut you down when you speak about that. But the problem is lived experience has been used as a tool to shut people down when they talk about certain issues, whether it be, pick your issue, whether it be the issue of abortion, issue of transgender, whatever. And that's also quite dangerous as well. Now the right might say that Christian and I was told this by someone when I told them I was going to be doing this speech. They said, Christian, tolerance, this is their exact words, tolerance will not save us from the barbarians that are trying to destroy our civilization. I'm going to imagine that some of you may feel the same way. And I understand that sentiment, because if we accept that the left has used tolerance as a tool against average Americans, if we accept that it's been used to push a political program, then the idea is, why would going back to that help us at all? What will help is not if just we have tolerance, but also if we have understanding. You can't have one without the other. If you're just going to tolerate someone and put up with them, there may be a point in time where you say, I don't want to put up with you anymore. And that feeling snaps, and all of a sudden the entire social fabric falls apart. But if you provide a culture of understanding, which the right is good at, conservatives are great at that, whether it be on the family, whether it be on tradition, whether it be on the importance of transcendent values, whether it be on religion, conservatives are great at providing a framework of understanding. But if you don't have that, tolerance is useless. But if you have that, tolerance is actually a great boon to society. So I think that on the left, the criticism that it somehow ignores racism is wrong. But on the right, the idea that it somehow leaves us open to attacks is also, it's not entirely wrong, but without that culture of understanding, and perhaps it is right, but with that culture of understanding like I'm advocating for, then it is absolutely wrong. So I think that in summation, it's probably important to emphasize one single thing. It's that tolerance is not a zero-sum game. It should be an equal partnership for all of us to be able to understand each other, no matter how different our beliefs are, no matter how different our worldviews are. And it should also be hopefully a challenge to all of us to get outside of our comfort zones and be able to perhaps walk a few steps in the other person's shoes. And by doing that, hopefully stoke a culture not of hostility, but of understanding. Even if you fundamentally disagree with the people that you're talking to, a culture of understanding that is against hostility, I think will ultimately be healthier for all of us. And so that is why I'm saying we need a new tolerance, one based on understanding, one based on neutrality, and one based on the willingness to engage with the other, and also to see the human being in the other. I'll close on this. My favorite philosopher, Roger Scruton, one of the legendary conservatives out of Britain, he said one of the biggest problems with scientists and academics is that they refuse to recognize the I in other people. And he used the symbology of the burning bush, right, where it said, I am that I am. Well, what that was trying to say, according to Scruton, is that there is an experience in someone else that is quite important to understand. And when you relate to that, you'll get out of your own bubble, you get out of your own head, and you'll be able to actually appreciate them as a human being. And I think that ultimately is a sin that we should absolutely use if we're going to survive and if we're going to also get a new tolerance. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.